Hello guys, this is Oroth and a warm welcome back to my channel. In today's video we're gonna look at some really cool Blood Knight builds. We're gonna look at a very strong raid build and also an adaptation to a dungeon run. So with me again today I have our favorite guest returning to the channel, Mobilux. Welcome back.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be back.
Yeah, and we received a lot of positive feedback on the last video where you made an appearance, and we created a huge splash with that build, and it has become very popular. So hopefully we can do something similar for the Blood Knight today. So before we dive into the builds of today's video, it would be interesting to hear your take on the Blood Knight in today's meta. Where does it stand compared to the other classes?
So I would say when it comes to PvE content and max damage output, Blood Knight might be arguably in the third position behind Necromancer and Demon Hunter. As we will see today, Blood Knights definitely have a pretty strong output when it comes to primary tech builds as well. Yep.
So do you really think that the Blood Knight can outdamage the Crusader as well?
That's a very good question. In terms of rates, I would probably say so. We can test it out really, but yeah, I mean, you're right. At the dummy, the Crusader is extremely strong.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see today how far we can push it. And of course, in the future, we're going to make some very clear comparisons between the classes and see where Blood Knight ends up on the list in terms of damage. But yeah, let's move on and start looking at the first build of today. And that is a raid/DPS build. Am I right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So let's dive into it and start with the skills that we are using. So first off, this is a primary attack build, as I was saying earlier, where we are using Shadow's Edge as the primary skill. Then we have Mephitic Cloud, Swarm of Bats, Shroud of Night, and Whirling Strike.
So let us look at the essences then, and maybe start with the helmet slot.
So in our helmet slot, we are using Master of Denier, which increases your damage by 19% after using Whirling Strike. In our chest piece, we're using Macabre Facade, which is a Shroud of Night essence, and that conjures 2 shadow appropriations that also deal primary attack damage, essentially. So in our shoulder slot, we're using Torture and Torment, which is a Swarm of Bats essence, which essentially causes your bats to bite the enemy whenever you use your primary attack. For pants, we are using Vile Grievances, which increases your attack speed while you're standing within the cloud. The first main hand, we have Bardiche of Below, which essentially just makes your Whirling Strike a very quick blast and quick animation, which is very important while we are choosing this essence, and we'll talk about this a little later. First offhand, we are using Mooncall, which essentially increases your primary attack speed by 30%. And second main hand, we have Cruel Vendetta, which just increases the damage of Shadow's Edge. And lastly, second offhand, Mercy's Plight, which causes an explosion after Shadow's Edge has hit the enemy 4 times. So that's it for the essences so far.
Perfect. And let us also go quick through the legendary gem.
Yes. So for the legendary gems, in terms of 1 star, we have Berserker's Eyes. 2 stars, Mother's Lament, Pale Class, Fervent Fang. 5 stars, Bottled Hope, Roiling Consequence, and Blood-Soaked Jade. And if you have watched the previous video about our Demon Hunter build, the gem setup is pretty much exactly the same here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually true. I didn't think about it. But yeah, let's talk more about both the essences and the legendary gems in just a little bit. But first, let us also look at the set pieces that we're using.
So in this setup, we're using 4 pieces of Vithus, 2 pieces of Banquet of Ice, and 2 pieces of Sharbars.
Okay, great. And I guess we will talk a little bit why we have chosen this specific set combination. But before we dive into that, let us start talking a little bit more about the essences. At first glance, I think that the helmet slot is a very interesting choice. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more why you chose Mask of the Mirror here?
Yeah, so mainly for the reason that I see plenty of people using the skill transfusion within their DPS builds for the Blood Knight, essentially only to keep up Vithus. But I was then trying to think of certain ways how to implement a 4th skill into the build that would be beneficial rather. So having said that, the helmet gives actually 90% damage increase using Whirling Strike, and that goes pretty nicely hand in hand with the first offhand, the Baldric of Below, as that, as I was alluding to earlier, gives a very quick animation, and so the combination of both keeps Vithus up all the time, plus it gives you an extra 19% damage increase here.
Yeah, it sounds very strong. And also this very, very short animation will not take away a lot of time from the primary attack spamming. Exactly. Yeah, I get the idea here for sure. Well, can we talk a little bit about some other essences here as well? Are there any particular here that you find more interesting than others?
Yep, so I would like to point out the pants here, the Mephitic Cloud pants via Grievances. So this is essentially now the 4th skill that I've included in this build, which gives you attack speed while standing within the cloud. And in doing so, we could now actually look to the set and realize that we don't need to use 4 pieces of Sharbars anymore, but we can switch out 2 pieces for what we are using here, 2 pieces of Banquet of Ice, which boosts our damage by 15%. Well, yes, to enemies suffering a continual damage, but that's what we have here in this build anyway.
Okay, so just for a clarification here, the cap on attack speed is 100%, and what you are saying now is that by including these pants, we are reaching the cap, even if we replace 4 pieces of Sharbars. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So we have 30% attack speed from Vithus, 30% from Mephitic Cloud, and another 30% from Mooncall, the one of the Shadow's Edge offhands. So that's 90 in total. And if you stack some attack speed on your Reforges, you will easily cap out attack speed here for this particular build.
Yeah, and also if you haven't been able to get attack speed on your Reforge, maybe you can find some legendary items with attack speed on them, just to make sure that you reach this cap. That's also something that I want to mention here, that you have to be very aware of these details when you are trying to make a build, because it's different for everyone. Me, for example, I don't use the attack speed on my Reforges, so I have to do some adaptations that Mobilux doesn't have to do. And the same goes for all of you viewers. If you want to try this build out, you have to check very carefully whether you reach the attack speed cap or not. And if not, maybe it's more reasonable to use 4 pieces of Sharbars instead. So you have to test it to be 100% sure.
I totally agree. Yeah.
Are there any other interesting choices here regarding the essences before we move on?
Yes. One other thing that I would like to mention is the chest piece. So again, in many, many cases, I see people using the chest Teeming Grotto, which is an armor break on the enemy once you're using swarm of bats. And so while this is a strong chest, I was trying to replace it because I'm also using, like you, Oroth, a dragon with lingering wounds, which applies a armor break of 35.5%. And those two armor breaks from the chest and the dragons don't stack. Meaning, if I'm using a dragon while I'm using the armor break chest of swarm of bats, it would essentially be a dead essence. So, having said all of that, so we switched out the chest to, as we already said, Markaba Facade, the Shroud of Night essence. And as a matter of fact, this is actually a very strong essence that pushes your damage quite significantly, I would argue.
Yeah, and this build is all about pushing the DPS up as much as possible. And this is also something that we can use in both raids and gauntlet, I suppose, or any types of content where we don't have to be that mobile, I guess.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, I also want to briefly mention the awakenings here, and I understand that not all the players can awaken their items, but there are some players who can, and then it might be interesting. And when we're using this build at the training dummy and we look on the breakdown, the most damage is done by Shadow's Edge. In second place, we have Swarm of Bats, and in third place, we have Shroud of Night. So it's in that order you should prioritize your awakenings. So that's why we have awakened here Cruel Vendetta, Mercy's Plight, and Mooncall, which all gives 10% damage increase to Shadow's Edge. And that's also why we have awakened the Shoulder here, which gives 10% damage increase to Swarm of Bats. So yeah, enough said about the awakenings. Do you have anything else that you want to add, Mobilux?
Yeah, so one last thing that I would like to point out, which is actually very beneficial to this build, particularly when we're talking about sustained damage, are certain magical attributes, especially beneficial effect duration and skill cooldown reduction. The more you can stack of those affixes, the more you will benefit from this build, really.
And just to clarify here, beneficial effect duration you can find on your chest, on your pants, on your waist, and on your feet. And you can find skill cooldown reduced on your necklace, your gloves, and on your rings. And once again, like I mentioned earlier in the video here, it's super important to focus on the details, because there are many people, they are not focusing on the details, and then they equip the same type of build as someone who focuses on the details, and the output will be, there will be a huge difference. So you can't just slack and equip random items and just pick the essences. You have to look in the details if you want to perform at a high level. And I want to stress this a lot, because if we take Gauntlet 6, for example, a lot of people are struggling with Gauntlet 6, and it's not only people with a little bit lower resonance. There are a lot of players around 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 resonance. They are not able to carry Gauntlet 6. And this is because they have not focused on the details. So this is for all the players, no matter if you're free to play or not. You have to focus on details. Thank you.
Well said.
Let's move on just briefly and talk about the Paragon. I guess it's simple. Which one are we using here?
So we're using Weaver for this build.
Okay. And for Warband, we use the damage room, right?
Yes, exactly.
And we also mentioned the familiar. And let's show a good familiar setup real quick here. This is my personal setup. I'm using this Brood Talon here. And if we look on the skills, we can see that I have lingering wounds. And I also have 200 insight. So whenever this passive skill is active, it will put an armor break on the target at 36.5%. And this is the strongest armor break in the entire game. So if you are not been able to get one yet, try to get your hands on a pet with lingering wounds. And it's especially good if you get it on your Brood Talent or on a Skitterwick with high insight. because that will buff the potency of this skill. And what's also interesting to mention here, I already mentioned it in my previous video, but before I was using another pet that had both lingering wounds and tenacity. And what tenacity does is that it reduces the cooldown of the familiar's active skill. But after some thinking, I realized that mathematically it's a lot better if lingering wounds is active at the same time as a lot of your legendary gems. And a lot of the cycles, the cooldown cycles of buffs from your gems are 20 seconds. So if you have a pet with tenacity, the longer the fight progresses, the more off sync your lingering wounds will be with your legendary gem cycle. So it actually makes sense to replace this pet I used before with this pet without tenacity. So that's just an interesting little take I want to add here. And also we can take a quick look at which traits to look for. Here again, I understand that not all players can optimize their familiars, but if you are able to get your hands on legendary trait familiars, I would first prioritize Maim, which gives increased critical hit chance, and in second place I would prioritize Bestial Might, which increases primary attack damage. So yeah, that's enough about familiars, I guess. Okay, so soon it's time for us to watch the dummy run to see how well we can perform now with this build. But before doing so, I would like to thank you so much again, Mobilux, for returning to this channel and enlighten us with your knowledge. Thank you so much, Mobilux.
Well, thank you very much. Again, it was a great pleasure like last time, and I can just stretch it one more time. If you want to have me again, I'm happy to come back for sure.
Yeah, I would love to have you back on the show again. And of course, we know that you have created many exciting builds, not only for the Blood Knight, but also for the Barbarian and for the Wizard. So we will 100% have you back on if you just want to come back, of course. So thank you so much, Mobilux, and let's move on now and look at the training dummy run.
Let's do that.
So here we see Mobilux at the training dummy, and he's going all in, and we can see that he manages to deal a lot of damage. In 5 seconds he reaches 16.8 million damage per second, and this is super high. It's not as high as we're able to push the Demon Hunter or the Crusader though, so keep that in mind. If we look on the 10-second result, we managed to push it above 30 million DPS, so still very good. And also here we want to show a little bit more sustained. At 30 seconds we managed to stay above 9 million, and at around 1 minute we managed to stay above 8 million. So what does this number tell us? These numbers tell us that the Blood Knight is indeed a very strong class that are able to dish out a lot of DPS, both for burst and for sustained damage. But what we can also say after looking at these numbers is that the Blood Knight right now is in a little bit of a tough spot, because even though it performs very well here, as we can see, it can deal a lot of damage, there are still other classes that can out damage the Blood Knight. And then we have to look at team compositions for certain types of content. So let's think about Gauntlet 6, for example. When we are putting together a Gauntlet 6 team, we have to think about who is gonna play which role. And then there are natural roles in a group. There will be some people who will focus on DPS. There will be some people that will focus on support in terms of buffing the teammates. And there might also be some players that are focusing on support by debuffing the target we're attacking. And as it stands right now, the Blood Knight is not really bad at anything, but it's not really the best at anything either. This means that when we are putting together these optimized teams for Gauntlet 6, for example, there is not a natural spot for the Blood Knight, because we can't bring in a Blood Knight for DPS, because then it would be a lot better to bring in a Demon Hunter or a Necromancer. We can't bring in the Blood Knight for support to buff the teammates, because let's just face it, the Blood Knight doesn't have those type of tools in its arsenal. And it's the same with debuffs. There are some interesting debuffs that could perhaps be useful. For example, there's a shoulder that prolongs harmful effect durations for any enemy standing within Mephitic Cloud. So that could go into some type of compositions. But all in all, I would say that it's quite difficult right now to fit the Blood Knight into these type of compositions. Of course, that's not everything. That's only for the top level, if you want to perform at 100% of your capacity. In other types of content, if we are talking about running dungeons or just enjoying the game, the Blood Knight is a very, very good and fun and decent class to play right now. And with this being said, let's move forward and look at how we will adapt this raid build so that we can run in the dungeons efficiently. So let us now look at what changes we are making when we want to go out into dungeons. And first of all, we can mention that we no longer use the Weaver Paragon, and instead we will use the Warden Paragon. And the reason for this is because we get this effect called Rugged, which increases our size by 5%. And when we combine this with Combat Expertise, it will increase our size by 8%. And the reason why we want to increase our size is because it will increase our movement speed. On top of this, we also get this effect called Combat Tricks, which allows us to move unhindered through enemies. And often in dungeons we want to move as quickly as possible from point A to point B, because at point B we want to engage a boss, for example. And when we are traveling from point A to B, sometimes there's a long corridor filled with packs of monsters, and we just want to ignore them and keep running to the boss. And without this effect from Warden, sometimes we get stuck on these packs and we have to kill the monsters. And this is something that we will avoid thanks to using Warden. So, very good Paragon for dungeon runs. Of course, I know that with this next update, we're gonna get an entire new system for the Paragon, but hopefully we will have similar effects. So, after the next patch, at least you know what type of effects you should look for in the Paragon tree. We can also look here that instead of the damage room, we are now using the protector room. And the reason for this is that we don't need the extra damage. What we want is even more mobility. And why are we using the protector room? Yes, if we look here on the remnants, there is a very good remnant called Shepherd's Burden. And what it says is that it increases our life, which doesn't matter, but more importantly, it increases our size by 15%. So when we combine the Warden Paragon with the Warband room, the Protector Warband room, we are able to increase our size by 23%. And what this does is that it increases our base speed by 23%. So if our base speed is 100 at normal size, the base speed will be 123 when we combine Warden and Protector room. And what it also does is that whenever you receive a movement speed buff, let's say that it's Issatar, for example, and you receive 30% movement speed buff, that 30% will be calculated on top of your base speed. So if you are normal size, you will gain 30% of 100. But if you are 23% bigger in size, you will gain 30% of 123, which is a greater number. So not only does your base speed increase, the size also increases the efficiency of movement speed buffs. We of course also have to take a look at the changes in the build itself. And first of all, we are no longer using Mephitic Cloud. Instead, we are using Sanguinate, and it increases our movement speed when we use it, and it also gives us a dash. so it's a very good skill for mobility. And on the same theme, to increase our mobility, we have changed the Whirling Strike essence to Indulgent Calligrapher. And what it says is that Whirling Strike now causes you to dash forward, damaging and knocking back enemies in your path, while also applying a stacking bleed. Whirling Strike can be activated again up to 2 additional times, with the final strike hitting all nearby enemies and knocking them airborne. So what it looks like is that whenever we use Whirling Strike, we will dash, and then we can dash up to 2 times more. And if you look around the skill button there, there's like a blue bar counting down, which shows us how much time left we have to use the dash again. So up to 3 times like this. Since we are no longer using Mephitic Cloud, we have also switched out the Pants essence, and the one that delivers the best after some texting for me is the Phases of Fading. And what it says is that Swarm of Bats now also poisons enemies, causing them to take continual damage for 3 seconds. And this is not a super important essence, but it's also neat because it will help you to activate Pain Clasp. And if you do not have Rolling Consequence, for example, then it's really good to use this Pants essence just to ensure that Pain Clasp is up all the time. One last thing to mention before we look at some dungeon runs is that since we also no longer use Mephitic Cloud, we do not get the primary attack speed buff from those pants that we were using. And if you remember earlier in this video, we said that as long as we were using those pants that increase the primary attack speed from standing in the Mephitic Cloud, then we no longer needed to use 4 pieces of Shalbas because we had capped our attack speed at 100%. But now, since we have removed that pants essence, we have to once again use 4 pieces of Shalbas. So I no longer use 2 pieces of Banquet, I use 4 pieces of Shalbas and 4 pieces of Vitus Urge. So this is exactly all the changes I have made for the dungeon version of this build. And let's now venture into some dungeons together to see how it works in action. And after the dungeon runs, I will also share with you a very nice little surprise in the end. A nice song I have prepared for you guys. So please stay tuned for that. And now let's watch the dungeons together. So we start by running Pit of Anguish. And usually I begin each dungeon by just activating Sanguinate. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to reach the boss as fast as possible. So pay close attention now to how I'm using the skills in order to maximize mobility. So I use Sanguinate and then I dash in the last moment. You can see the blue bar there around the Sanguinate skill when I use it. And I have to dash before that blue bar runs out. And yeah, as you can see, this dungeon is often quite bugged. And directly here after the elevator, I'm using Sanguinate. It seems like my friend got bugged here, Mobilux, but we are able to reach the boss fairly quick. And here is the reason why I've told you before, we want to focus a lot on mobility, but we don't want to sacrifice all of the DPS. So we have to find the correct balance so that we are still able to kill the boss fast when we reach it. But all in all, we spend more time running than fighting, so therefore it's more important to increase mobility compared to damage, as long as we reach a break even in terms of DPS. So yeah, this is the Pit of Anguish, and I thought it was a good dungeon to showcase the mobility of this build. And we're also going to take a look at Fahir. In my previous videos I've been telling you which strategies we are usually doing in Fahir, and the best is if I go solo to the left here, and then we have a very strong DPS going to the right, either alone or with someone else, and then there should be one here at the middle door that can open as soon as the idols are dead, and then they should dash as fast as possible to trigger the boss here in the middle. And if you do this strategy, you could, and you do it in a good way, you can scrape off like 10 seconds only by doing it that way. And if you can scrape off 10 seconds on every dungeon run, that's gonna add up to a lot in the long run. Well, yeah, I also forgot to mention that we also switched out another offhand essence so that we get more AoE damage. Instead of this offhand that causes an explosion from Shadow's Edge every 4 hits, we now shoot Shadow's Edge that ricochets and hits multiple targets. Also a small little addition in the dungeon build that I forgot to mention. And now, after the elevator, let's dash as fast as possible to the boss and just kill it as fast as we can. So yeah, I mean, it's clear here that we have enough mobility, and also we have enough mobility to reach point B when we start at point A, so that we don't need Issatar really. We could switch in 2 pieces of Issatar to gain some extra movement speed, of course, but as you can see, it's not necessary. And while we're using Sanguinate, we will not gain anything from the Issatar buff anyways, because the Sanguinate movement speed buff is stronger. So once again here, 1 Sanguinate and 3 dashes takes us from point A to point B. And yeah, we're slowly closing in on the end of this video. And before reaching the end, I really want to thank you so much for tuning in. And I really hope that you enjoyed this build, both the raid version and the dungeon version. And don't go away yet, because as I said, I have prepared a little surprise for you here at the end of this video. But I also want to say that wherever you are, I want to wish you a very nice day or a very nice evening. And of course, to all of my clan members in Nyx, I would also like to say Voruk Nyx Sholaxul. So now let us listen to this song together, and bye bye!
Guess who's back with some brand new content? Hit the bell button, maybe leave a comment. Oroth with the swagger, wanna see his game. Teach you all the secrets, it will be insane. Guess who's back with a brand new lesson? He will have the answer if you have a question. Oroth invites you to his awesome tribe. No more time to waste, it's time to hit subscribe. 1, 2, 3 is the man of our affection. 4, 5, 6 only aiming for perfection. 7, 8, 9 he is 10 out of 10. Subscribe and you will never miss a video again.